Have you ever seen a child crying from hunger, and no one doing anything? Between shelves full of bread and hurried looks, a girl of only 9 years old, orphaned, dirty, and invisible to the eyes of society, sobbed in silence, leaning against a corner of the market. The pain in her stomach was mixed with shame. Every step she took was like a cry for help that no one wanted to hear. People passed by, averted their eyes, quickened their pace, as if ignoring were easier than reaching out. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt so alone that you believed no one would care if you disappeared? Sometimes the whole world turns its face, until someone, out of nowhere, does something that no one expected. But what happened to this girl? Like the video, subscribe to the channel and come with me, because this true story will move you from the first second. In the late afternoon, when the movement in the market began to subside, and the warm smell of freshly baked bread still hung in the air, a small frail figure crossed the entrance without making a sound. She was a girl of only 9 years old. His thin body hid his hunger for days. His thin legs almost stumbled in his own steps. The hair stuck to his forehead, mixed with sweat and dust, framed a face marked by dirt and sadness. The clothes, torn and loose, looked more like rags than clothes. And the eyes. The eyes did not lie. Eyes too big for the small face. Eyes that carried an old pain of someone who had already seen the world turn its back too soon. She entered slowly, as if she were invading a place where she was not welcome. He passed by the full carts, the tidy people, the hurried smiles that arise between one purchase and another. No one stopped to look, and those who looked away turned their faces away right away, as if it wasn't their problem. She didn't ask. I just watched. First he passed through the fruit section, where some apples glowed in the white light, then through the shelves of cookies, which seemed to smile inside their colorful packaging. But it was when she arrived at the bakery that her eyes were fixed on a simple basket of French breads, still warm, covered with a thin cloth. She stayed there. It didn't move for a long time. I just watched. Her stomach, already too empty, seemed to protest with cramps. Her throat was dry, but she couldn't get out of there. The smell of bread enveloped her like a cruel promise, so close and completely out of reach. The girl raised one hand and touched the metal of the greenhouse with her dirty fingers. It was not courage that was lacking, it was hope. The certainty that even if he asked, no one would give. Meanwhile, the sounds of the market continued normally. Someone was passing by discussing the price of rice. Another person complained about the queue at the cashier. An employee was pushing a replacement cart with packets of sugar, and there in the middle of it all that child remained invisible. Not even the crying, contained, muffled, almost swallowed, was enough to attract attention. The kind of crying that doesn't have the strength to make a scandal. A cry that doesn't ask for help. He just escapes unintentionally. She tried to disguise it. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, looked around for fear of being noticed, and yet her eyes watered again. Not because of physical pain, but because of something even worse. The certainty that for that place, for those people, she did not exist. And if it existed, it was like a stain. A mistake in the landscape. An uncomfortable reminder of a reality that no one wanted to face. Time seemed to have stopped for her. Every second in front of that shelf stretched as if waiting for a miracle. His hands sweaty, his mouth half open, his knees wobbly. It wasn't just hunger that hurt. It was the absence of someone, from anyone. A gesture, a word, a look of compassion. Nothing. She was alone in that world full of people, and it was when her legs failed for a moment that she leaned against the bread rack, as if she wanted to melt with the icy metal and disappear. The tears now flowed uncontrollably. The head bowed, the small shoulders trembling. The scene was heartbreaking, but no one stopped. Nobody wanted to get involved. It was easier to pretend you didn't see it. The contrast was brutal. Happy families passed by with their well-fed children. Laughter echoed from the cold aisle. Couples discussed the dinner menu. But there, in the middle of it all, that girl seemed to belong to a parallel universe made up of silent pain and oblivion. And even without asking for anything, even without saying a single word, His presence bothered him. An employee of the market cast a cross look. A lady in high heels whispered something to her husband. A young man passing by made a point of deviating from the path, as if suffering smells and everyone is trying to avoid it. What no one knew is that she had been there for hours. I had entered even before the sun began to set. She walked around the city asking for leftovers, being ignored, taking them closed, hearing doors slam. And now, in that common market, in some neighborhood, she had reached her limit, but fate is curious. Because it is just when all seems lost, when the soul is almost saying goodbye to faith, that something unexpected can arise. And at that moment, something or someone was about to cross that girl's path. Not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a breath of humanity. Whether or not this breath would come, she still didn't know. All that remained now was silence, the chill of the night that was beginning to fall, and the muffled sound of tears dripping on the floor. Did you like this story so far? Then leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Enjoy and tell me from which city are you watching this story. Time in the market seemed to have stopped just for her, while everything around her followed at a fast pace. Carts in a hurry, bags being filled, promotions being announced over the loudspeakers. The girl was still there, motionless, with her forehead against the metal edge of the bread rack, as if that fragile support was the only thing that kept her from falling. The smell of hot bread, which for others was an invitation, for her was torture. The stomach was churning, the whole body ached. But more than the physical pain, it was the shame that began to weigh on her shoulders. That cruel feeling of occupying a place that was not hers, of being just a hindrance in the way of others. A child with nothing, surrounded by everything. It was as if he were in the middle of a living window, where everyone could see his misery, but no one felt responsible for it. The carts that passed by were full of food, colorful fruits, milk cartons, packages of biscuits, trays of meat. And she, empty-handed, just watched. There were no coins in his pocket, not even pockets. The torn clothes hung on his body as if screaming for help at every step. And even so, there was no shortage of crossed looks. It was not pity that was seen in the expressions. It was uncomfortable, judgment, revulsion. On the other side of the bakery, an employee watched suspiciously. She was a middle-aged woman with a crumpled uniform and a tired expression. But even fatigue did not erase the tone of impatience on his face. She approached with quick steps, the sound of her sandals echoing between the gondolas. He looked at the girl as if he were facing a threat. His eyes scanned every inch of the child, as if looking for signs that he intended to steal something. He didn't ask if he was okay. I didn't want to know why she was there alone. He just ordered him to leave. The girl, frightened, took a step back. Her eyes widened, her body shrank instinctively, but she didn't really move. Fear paralyzed her, and also hunger, which prevented her from thinking clearly. It was enough to catch the attention of a man passing by, pushing a cart full of expensive items, prime cuts of meat, imported wines, fine cheeses. He interrupted the route, turned his face and faced the scene with an air of superiority. He made a point of raising his voice. He complained about the lack of control, the mess that these street children cause. He said that this type of situation could not happen in a decent place. Other eyes turned. Now she was surrounded, not physically but emotionally, as if everyone was wielding invisible fingers, pointing at her with accusations that came dressed up as civility. The girl wanted to disappear. Every word he heard felt like a punch. Her breathing became short, his face burned with shame. She tried to hide behind the shelf, but it was too late. The trial had begun, and there was no way to appeal. Everyone was watching, everyone murmured, and no one, absolutely no one, reached out. A well-dressed lady passed by and wrinkled her nose. A teenager laughed softly, whispering something to his friend. Even a younger child, holding his mother's hand, watched this girl with a confused look, as if he were facing something strange that he could not name. And maybe that's exactly what she represented to that world. Something strange, out of place. An uncomfortable reminder that there is misery, even among abundant shelves. The employee, now angrier, threatened to call security. He said that the manager would not allow this type of situation. The girl then tried to say something, maybe apologize, maybe say that I didn't want to bother. But the words did not come out. The dry throat only allowed tears to come down even faster. They were no longer discreet. They were no longer contained. It was an open, desperate cry of someone who had already swallowed too much pain and no longer had the strength to hide it, and no one, absolutely no one, thought it was. Strange, because in some cruel way the suffering of a child had become commonplace. Invisible, part of the urban scenery, something that is easily ignored and forgotten after 3 steps. Her pain was hers alone, and that at that moment seemed definitive. She shrank even more, his back glued to the bookshelf, his eyes on the floor, his arms crossed as if he could protect himself from something that could not be avoided. The shame was so deep that it no longer hurt like a blow, but like a constant weight that crushed his will to exist. No one gave him a chance to explain. No one asked his name. No one wanted to know why a 9-year-old girl was standing there alone, crying in front of a basket of bread. All he received were orders to leave, disapproving looks and harsh words that would echo for a long time, and even with all that, she couldn't leave, because leaving meant staying hungry. And at that moment, between fear and humiliation, despair was even stronger. It was thus in that public scene of embarrassment that rock bottom was revealed. A dark, cold background full of eyes, but without any outstretched hands. She didn't know it, but she was seconds away from something that would change everything. There was still no hope in his heart, only the echo of injustice and the bitter taste of not belonging anywhere. And as a new group of customers passed distractedly through the bakery, as new voices overrode the hubbub of the market, something or someone quietly approached. No rush, no judgment, without raising your voice. Someone who, at that very moment, was walking towards the girl, carrying in her eyes something she hadn't seen for a long time: kindness. In the muffled confusion of the market, among the hurried voices, the noises of the packages and the hurried footsteps, there was something that clashed with the common rhythm of that place, a discreet, almost imperceptible silence that formed around an elderly lady. She was still, far enough away not to be noticed right away, but close enough to see clearly everything that had just happened. She was a woman of calm gestures, simple clothes, and a face marked by time. But the kind of time that not only passes but shapes. Her eyes carried no judgment. They carried history. And at that moment, when everyone turned to go on with their lives, she remained looking at the girl as if she sees more than she sees. While most had already forgotten the child huddled near the loaves, the lady took a step, then another. He walked with the firmness of someone who has faced many difficult paths. There was no hurry, there was no fear, and there was no hesitation either. Just a serene movement, as if each step towards the girl was inevitable, as if something greater was guiding her. His old shoes made little noise on the waxed floor. The fabric bag swayed slightly on his arm. She approached not as someone who is going to intervene, but as someone who is going to listen, and that in itself was already rare. When she finally got close, she stopped a few inches from the girl. The child continued with her face down, her body shrunken, her eyes fixed on some point on the floor that only she could see. He did not immediately notice that different presence, but little by little he felt it. Perhaps it was the smell of the mild soap escaping from the lady's skin, or the absence of threat in gestures. Maybe it was just instinct, the same one that makes children realize when they are, finally, in front of someone who doesn't want to hurt. She looked up slowly, still afraid. And it was there, in that brief and silent instant, that the two eyes crossed. There were no words, but there was something that passed from one to the other, as if it were an invisible thread, a recognition, a type of encounter that cannot be explained. Because the lady, even without saying anything, seemed to know exactly what that girl was, feeling. And the girl, even without understanding why, felt that maybe, just maybe, she was no longer completely alone. The market was still in the background, like a distant soundtrack, but now everything seemed suspended, as if time, out of Respect for that meeting had slowed down for an instant. The lady kept her gaze steady but without invading. Expected. Watched. It gave space. Until, with a delicate gesture, he opened his bag and took out a small paper bag. It was a loaf of bread. Simple, freshly bought, yet warm. She held it out to the girl with both hands, as if offering not only food, but a chance. The girl hesitated. Not out of pride, not even for lack of will, but because I wasn't used to it. All my life, everything that came with outstretched hands came with a price. And there, in the face of that silent gesture, fear spoke louder for a brief moment. Her eyes narrowed. Her body shrank even more, as if trying to calculate if it was safe. But something in the presence of this woman disarmed the hardest defenses. It was not immediate. It wasn't like in the movies, where everything is solved with a look. It was slow, cautious. The girl stretched out her hand with uncertain movements, took the bread gently, as if she were afraid of breaking it, and held it to her chest. He still didn't eat. He still didn't say anything. But now there was something different about his countenance, a subtle trace of relief. As if, for the first time in a long time, someone had seen in her more than a hungry child. The lady then sat slowly on one of the wooden benches near the entrance to the market. He sat down with the naturalness of someone who was in no hurry to leave, from those who had all the time in the world to wait for confidence to sprout. The girl watched her from afar, with a furrowed brow, as if she didn't quite know what to do with that new type of presence. He still held the bread tightly, as if it were his greatest treasure, but the look was no longer just fear. It was curiosity. People kept passing by, but now what was once an invisible scene became something that drew attention for another reason. Some looked at it without understanding, others pretended not to notice, but no one approached. It was as if a small universe had formed there, between that woman and that girl, and only they could enter. Gradually, the girl took 2 steps, then one more, still suspicious, like an injured animal that doesn't know if it can approach the hand. That calls it. The lady remained motionless. He didn't force it, it was just there, present. And sometimes that's all anyone needs, a steady, silent and humane presence. It was in this atmosphere, of pause, of care, of something new emerging in the middle of the concrete, that the girl finally took the last step she was missing. Now he was a few centimeters from the lady. He still hadn't spoken, but the gesture of sitting on the next seat said more than any words. She still didn't trust it. But for the first time, perhaps he was considering the possibility. And as the sun outside began to set, tinting the streets a melancholy gold, the market took its course. Purchases being made, lives being lived. But in that forgotten corner, between the bank and the bakery, something was born that no one expected. A silent exchange, a bond that still had no name but already had strength, because sometimes it all starts like this, with a look. The wooden bench where they were now sitting seemed to have been placed there just for that moment. It was simple, weathered, with the paint peeling off the edges and marks of sun and rain registered in each crack. And yet in that instant, it was like a silent shelter in the midst of a hurried and indifferent world. The girl remained silent. The bread, still warm, now rested in her small hands, held firmly and with a certain reverence, as if she did not fully believe that it was really hers. The lady next to her kept her serene gaze fixed on the movement of people entering and leaving the market. He didn't press her with questions. He did not try to invade that fragile space of those who still did not know if he could trust. He was just there, a presence that demanded nothing but offered everything. From time to time, he looked askance at the girl, watching carefully, but without forcing contact. Time, in that small universe of 2, was measured by deep breaths and silences that spoke louder than any words. After a few minutes, the lady stood up calmly. His body showed signs of age, but his movements were still firm. He walked slowly to one of the sections of the market and returned a few minutes later with a brown paper bag in his hands. Inside, some simple items: fruit, milk, a package of cookies and 2 more loaves of bread. Without saying anything, he placed the bag next to the girl as if delivering an offer without expecting anything in return. It was a small gesture, but full of intention. The girl looked at the bag, then at the lady. The eyes were still suspicious, but there was something different about them now, a curiosity mixed with hesitation. It was as if his mind wanted to run, but his body was still trapped by fear, and somehow also by desire, and that very human desire to no longer be alone. The lady then took a small step to the side, creating space, offering a direction without pointing. And he stood there, waiting. He said nothing, did not extend his hand, did not beg. He just waited. A patient wait, full of calm hope, as if knowing that certain decisions need to be born from within, and that pushing them ahead of time can break something irretrievable. The girl looked again at the bag, then at the lady. The conflict was visible in his gestures. I wanted to trust, but I didn't know if I could. I wanted to follow, but fear still whispered that it was dangerous. Life had already taught that not every smile is sincere, nor every outstretched hand is kind. And yet there was something about this woman that stood out from the rest of the world. Maybe it was the calm, maybe it was the silence, maybe it was the fact that she wasn't trying to convince, just offering, hunger, insistent, poked from within. But it was more than hunger. It was fatigue, the cold, the exhaustion of not having a place to rest your feet, and also loneliness, the one that throbs in the chest of those who have not heard their own name being said with affection for a long time. Then, with her gaze still down, the girl picked up the bag with both hands and stood up. His steps were short, cautious, like someone crossing an unknown ground. The lady waited for her to come closer, and then, with a slight nod, turned to walk. They left the market side by side. There was no physical contact, no conversation. Just two bodies walking in silence under the evening light, which now spread in golden tones across the sidewalks. The girl looked around all the time as if fearing being followed or judged. His body remained tense, ready to flee at any sign of danger. But something inside her was beginning to move, albeit slowly. A thin thread of trust that crept through the rubble of distrust. The path was simple. Quiet streets, modest houses, trees swaying in the light wind. The lady walked with firm steps, keeping a comfortable pace, as if she knew every stone on the sidewalk. From time to time he would discreetly look at the girl, making sure she was still there. And she was, in silence, carrying the bag carefully, as if fearing to lose the little he received. The girl's thoughts were a whirlwind. He tried to understand. What was happening? He tried to predict what was coming. He tried to find fault with that gesture. But no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find it. It wasn't long before they rounded a corner and stopped in front of a house. It was small, with light walls, wooden windows, and a small garden in front. The flowers, simple and well cared for, contrasted with the dirt floor. The house had the air of shelter, one of those that exude history, warmth, and longing. The lady opened the gate naturally, as if she was not only receiving someone, but allowing the entry of something she had not felt for a long time, company. The girl stopped on the sidewalk, hesitant. He looked at the open gate, then at the lady. The feet wanted to move forward, but the heart still tried to understand. It was hard to believe that someone would open their home like that. It was difficult to accept that, after so much contempt. There was still room for shelter, but there was something about the way the door of the house was ajar, as if to say, "You can come in, only if you want to." No pressure, no commands, just a silent invitation. And it was this silence, perhaps, that convinced. The absence of charge, the absence of promises. Just a pure gesture, almost forgotten these days, that of caring. The girl took another step, then another, and she entered through the gate, still clinging to the bag of food, as if it were her guarantee of safety. The lady followed her without saying a word, and for an instant that modest backyard was filled with a kind of presence that not even the wind could erase. When the door of the house closed behind them, night was already beginning to fall, and the street lights were gradually turned on. Outside the world went on, but inside something new had begun, and even though the fear wasn't gone completely, for the first time in a long time, he was no longer alone. Inside the house, the air had a faint smell of old wood mixed with dried herbs, somewhere between chamomile and rosemary. The smooth, clean, cold cement floor creaked slightly under the girl's shy steps, as if the house, accustomed to silence, was adjusting to the presence of someone new. The walls were clear, marked here and there by small nature pictures and aged portraits. There was a light curtain dancing softly in the evening breeze, and a wall clock marked time with its paused ticking, filling in the absence of voices. She stopped right at the entrance, not knowing if she could advance further. The gaze scanned the environment with the same caution as someone who enters an unknown territory. There was no luxury, but everything there exuded care. The worn carpet was well extended, the tablecloth had hand-embroidered edges, and the crockery in the cupboard, while simple, was perfectly aligned. Every detail told a story, perhaps of someone who had lived long but now lived alone. The lady left the keys on a sideboard and went to the kitchen with firm steps. The girl followed her with her eyes still silent, as if observing a sacred ritual. The space was small but cozy. A kettle was already on the stove. Within minutes, the sound of boiling water mixed with the aroma of rice being sautéed. The lady made no fuss, no questions. I just cooked. It was as if, somehow, she knew that this simple gesture had the power to pierce through entire layers of accumulated pain. While waiting, the girl remained near the door, holding the bag of food close to her chest. The bread had already been partially eaten, still on the way, but the rest was intact, stored as a treasure. She looked around with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. I didn't understand what was happening. He didn't understand why that woman was doing all that. And the silence that filled the house, although welcoming, made it even more confused. Because there was no television on, no voices, no hurried footsteps, just a tranquil, almost ritualistic emptiness, as if time passed there differently. Soon, the smell of ready-to-eat food filled the air with a delicacy that seemed to embrace. The lady prepared the table calmly, a plate, a glass cup, simple cutlery. He put small portions of rice, beans, and boiled vegetables. He served everything with the attention of someone who knows the value of the gesture. Then, with a subtle nod, he invited the girl to sit down. She hesitated for a moment, then walked slowly to her chair and settled into the same insecurity as one who fears breaking some invisible rule. The first fork was like a relief. The hunger that had fallen silent because of fear now screamed again. She ate carefully for the first few minutes, watching if the lady would scold her. As this did not happen, he was loosened, and then he devoured it. Each spoonful seemed to carry days of absence, of empty stomach, of rejections. The lady just watched, without interrupting. He didn't ask where she came from or why she was alone. I just watched as if I understood that, at that moment, silence was the greatest gesture of respect. The girl finished the plate in a short time and looked around, not knowing whether to thank her or just wait for instructions. But no, word came from you. She got up slowly, took a towel and handed it to the girl to clean her hands. Then he took the plate to the sink and started washing. The movements were slow, precise, almost meditative. The whole house seemed to work at the same pace, paused, gentle, full of space. The girl then, for the first time, spoke. His voice came out low, scratched, as if words had been stuck for a long time. She asked if she could stay alone for one night. That was all he could say. A simple question, which carried the weight of someone who had learned not to expect too much. The lady, without turning around, just gave a slight smile, and that smile, silent like everything else she did, had the force of a complete answer. With a calm gesture, she pointed to a room that led to the back of the house. It was small but clean, a mattress with a flowered sheet, a chair next to it, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed. All modest but prepared. It was impossible not to feel that this space had been waiting for someone for a long time. The girl entered slowly, left the bag on the floor and approached the bed barefoot, slowly sinking into the mattress as if testing if it was really real. Outside, the night was silent. A few cars were still passing on the street, and the wind swayed the leaves of the trees gently. Inside the house, time seemed to have stopped. There was no noise, no explanations, just an almost sacred calm that enveloped everything. The girl lay on her side with her eyes open, still alert. But the muscles began to relax, as if the body after so long began to understand that there was no need to flee. The lady passed through the half-open door with a blanket in her hands. He placed it carefully on the girl, who pretended to be asleep, but kept her eyes open. There was an almost maternal care in every gesture, a presence that did not demand retribution. And in that silent environment, what seemed empty turned out to be full of memory, of affection, of possibilities that had not yet been named. The girl took a deep breath, trying to understand what she felt. There was still fear, but now it came mixed with something new, a strange, almost forgotten feeling of being safe. Maybe it wasn't exactly confidence yet, but it was the first step towards it, and as the clock in the room marked the passing of the hours with its slow ticking, something inside her also began to move. A kind of timid hope which still didn't know if it could grow, but could no longer fit in the dark. The next morning the light invaded the room gently, passing through the cracks in the curtain, as if asking permission to wake up. It took the girl a few seconds to understand where she was. For a brief moment, he thought it was still a dream. The soft sheet, the silence of the house, the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen, all of that was too strange to be a reality. He turned slowly on the bed, and his eyes, still heavy, scanned the room cautiously. There was no one there, but the door was still ajar, as it had been the night before. The feeling that she was still welcome was in the air, hovering lightly. He stood up slowly, his feet touching the cold ground hesitantly. The clothes were still the same, wrinkled with the smell of street and abandonment, but the body was already moving with less fear. He walked to the door, shuffling his steps until he reached the kitchen. The lady was there as if she hadn't left since dinner. The stove crackled with a kettle on the fire, and there was a plate of bread and fruit on the table. Nothing was said. It was not necessary. The silence between them had already learned to talk. The girl ate slowly this time. It was no longer hunger that guided, but the attempt to understand that new space where care did not come with demands. Then she got up, took the plate to the sink and stood there, looking at the window. Outside, the world seemed the same as always, but something inside her had already changed. An almost imperceptible movement, but one that, for those who have lived through so many absences, makes all the difference. The following days followed this same silent and constant rhythm. In the morning, the lady took care of the garden, swept the yard, watered the plants. The girl watched her from afar, sitting on the porch step or leaning against some corner of the room. With each gesture of the elderly woman, a silent message was transmitted: "You can stay." In the afternoon, they prepared small meals together with few ingredients, but always done calmly. At night, the house was once again taken by silence, cut only by the ticking of the clock and the sound of leaves moving outside. Little by little, the girl loosened up, not with words, but with gestures. She began to help with the dishes, to fold the dish towels, to place flowers in a small vase on the table. The lady, in turn, did not comment, just smile with that smile that says everything without saying anything. It was as if, somewhere in the past, she knew exactly how to act, as if that delicate presence in her home was not a coincidence, but a reunion. It was on a colder afternoon, while they were cutting vegetables together, that the lady said something more than necessary. Her voice broke the silence in a natural way, as if it was already part of the routine. And what he said was not a question nor an order. It was a memory brought to the surface with sweetness without weight. She spoke of a daughter who had had big eyes and dark hair, a cheerful girl who loved to plant daisies in the garden and ran around the house singing, a girl who one day went out to play and never returned, the girl who until then had been cutting carrots with concentration, stopped the movement. He did not look up, but listened to every word carefully. The lady's voice was firm, but it brought a contained melancholy, as someone who learned to live with longing without letting it overflow every day. The story was not long. A brief report was enough for the girl to understand everything. The silence of the house, the bed made, the flowers well cared for, the attention to detail. That house had been built to love, and since the loss, she had been waiting in silence for a new chance. After that day, something changed between the two. The girl, still not knowing exactly how, felt that she was now part of something. She was not just a guest, nor a temporary passage. There was a bond being born, silent and firm. He began to smile, not with his lips but with his eyes. He began to observe the lady with more interest. I noticed how she folded the laundry, how she prepared tea, how she cleaned the window with slow movements. And for the first time in a long time he felt like imitating, to learn, to stay. The lady in turn also looked different. The rhythm of the house changed little by little. There was more boiling water for 2 cups of tea, more sliced bread on the table, more noise of small footsteps echoing across the floor. The garden received new flowers. The portraits on the wall seemed to smile more lively. And the clock, once a solitary reminder of the passing of time, now set the pace of a shared routine. Sometimes they sat together on the porch at dusk. The girl rested her head on the arm of the chair, watching the sky change color. The lady, with her eyes closed, breathed in the smell of the plants around. No words were needed. Just the presence of each other was enough. There was something almost magical about that silent complicity. A kind of reunion between 2 broken lives, which, when they crossed paths, discovered that it was still possible to start over. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew this was the beginning of something bigger. Because somewhere between loss and reunion, between fear and affection, a bond had formed. A bond that needed no promises or explanations. It just needed to exist. As the weeks passed, the once quiet house began to take on new sounds. Shy laughter, small footsteps in the hallway, the clinking of cutlery in pairs. The routine was arranged like a fabric being embroidered little by little, stitch by stitch, with patience and affection. The girl, now looser, continued to observe every detail of that new world that had welcomed her without questions, and the lady, with her slow and firm gestures, continued to teach without words everything that only time knows how to teach. The mornings became more lively. The girl helped set the table, carefully sorted the cutlery, cleaned the dry leaves in the yard, and from time to time watered the plants with almost ceremonial care. The days flowed like this, surrounded by small rituals that gave shape to what was once just survival. But there was something that was still missing, a step that the girl had never taken, something that was not part of her reality until then: going to school. It was on a Sunday afternoon, while they were organizing together some old books that the lady kept in a wooden box in the closet, that this new path began to take shape. The girl's eyes shone before the yellowed pages, even though she did not know how to read all the texts. Curiosity pulsed in every question, in every attempt to guess what those letters meant. And the lady, realizing that, began to bring to the surface a dream that perhaps the girl herself did not even know she had. A few days later, they were sitting in front of a desk at the nearest school. The girl remained silent, her body withdrawn, her eyes downcast. The room was cold, with bare walls and voices echoing in the background. The lady, next to her, maintained her firm but welcoming posture. He introduced the girl, explained what was necessary, and enrolled with the serenity of someone who already knew that it would change everything. On the first day of school, the girl wore a simple dress, adjusted with care, and carried a small backpack with a new notebook and 2 pencils. He walked beside the lady with his shoulders tense and his heart racing. School for her was an unknown world, full of noises, laughter, screams, footsteps running through the halls. Everything seemed too big, too fast, too scary. The first few weeks were difficult. She didn't know anyone. The children noticed his different clothes, his shyness, his silence. And as happened so often, the difference became a laughingstock. Whispered comments, mocking looks, small gestures that, for those who carry so many invisible scars, hurt like new wounds. The girl returned home in silence, her eyes teary, but her mouth closed. He didn't complain. I just kept it. The lady understood everything, even without being said. And, as always, he responded with presence. I waited with a snack ready, a kind word, a story to distract, a book to share. He began to help with homework, sitting next to him, pointing out words, showing how to do simple math. With each new achievement came a sincere compliment. It wasn't exaggerated enthusiasm, it was recognition, the kind of praise that builds from within. The girl, little by little, began to allow herself. He raised his hand in the classroom to answer. He participated in the activities. From time to time, she laughed at something with her classmates. One day, she brought home a colorful drawing with her name written in crooked letters in the corner. It was the first time he wrote his full name. They put the paper on the wall of the living room, between the old paintings and the memories that already lived there. The roots began to grow, not visible, but firm. She no longer walked hunched over. He no longer avoided the mirror. He no longer hid in the corners of the room, and it was on one of these afternoons in the midst of books and colored pencils that she said simply, she wanted to be a teacher. The sentence came out low but full of certainty. It wasn't just a loose idea, it was the beginning of a purpose. The lady listened, smiled, and with a delicate gesture placed in front of her another book, as if to say, "So, let's start here." And they began, with reading aloud, with scribbled exercises, with words spelled out little by little. The girl clung to each new learning as if it were a piece of future built with her own hands. She was no longer just welcomed, she was encouraged, guided, inspired. The school, which was once a strange place, became a space where she really existed. She made shy friendships, participated in group work, learned to talk about herself without lowering her eyes. He began to dream big, even if in silence. The road was long, but she knew she was not alone. And with each new step, he felt that, at last he had left the place where one can only survive, and began finally to live. The years passed with the same delicacy that marked every gesture in the house. Time, once the girl's silent enemy, was now a companion of discoveries, an ally of dreams that previously seemed unattainable. The school routine, the books she read, carefully, the notebooks scribbled with new words, everything piled up like bricks in the construction of a future she never imagined could be hers. The girl was no longer so girl. The delicate features gained more defined contours. The voice, previously hesitant, now sounded firm in school presentations. What began with fear and silence had been transformed into an active voice, clear ideas, an immense desire to learn and teach. And with each handwritten lesson, each assignment delivered, each shy smile exchanged with her colleagues, she gradually moved away from that image of an invisible child in the market. The lady watched her with attentive eyes, always present, even when she could no longer help with the tasks with the same agility as before. The body aged, yes, but the gaze kept the flame of hope burning. Seeing that girl, once so fragile and scared, now walking through corridors with books in her arms and words on her lips, was like reliving an old dream that had been buried with the pain of a loss. It was more than welcoming someone. It was rediscovering a part of yourself that had fallen silent. Over time, the girl participated in school fairs, wrote award-winning essays, was called to represent the class at events. He still felt afraid sometimes. He still remembered the butterflies in his stomach when he entered that school for the first time. But now he knew who he was. And more than that, he knew who he wanted to be. The idea of being a teacher had not changed. On the contrary, it had grown inside her like a strong tree with deep roots in the fertile soil of gratitude. I wanted to teach not only content, but also courage. I wanted to show other children that it was possible to start over even when everything seemed lost. And above all, she wanted to be to someone what that lady had been to her. A safe haven, a silent push, a firm presence even on cloudy days. The studies continued steadily. He entered high school with difficulties, but with a thirst to win. I spent sleepless nights with my books open and my eyes tired, memorizing formulas, interpreting texts, learning more than what school taught. And in each stage overcome, the lady's gaze remained her greatest reward. There was no need for applause. A simple nod, a discreet smile were enough for the girl to know that she was on the right path. When the last year arrived, the challenge was greater. The entrance exam seemed like a distant mountain, but she didn't give up. She studied with borrowed books, with handwritten summaries, with videos watched on the lady's old cell phone, and, at the same time, she helped at home, took care of the garden, accompanied the lady to medical appointments which now became more frequent. The health of the woman who had taken her in was no longer the same. The steps were slower, the movements more limited, the fatigue more constant. But there were never any complaints. She smiled even in pain, offered tea even with trembling hands, spoke soft words even on the weakest days. The girl, now young, learned from her what was not in the books, about dignity, patience, and love. The result of the race came on a Saturday morning. The young woman, sitting on the porch, trembled as she opened the envelope. When he read the word approved, he didn't scream, he didn't cry right away. He just looked at the lady who already seemed to know. The hug was long, tight, silent like everything they had built. A hug that said, "We did it." Then came the college years. More studies, more challenges, more sleepless nights. The young woman took a crowded bus, had a cold lunchbox, did work in the library until the last second. But at no time did he think about giving up. He knew what he was building. He knew who he was doing all that for. On weekends, he would return home, help the lady with the medicines, tell the news, read excerpts from the books aloud. They laughed together. They cried together. They lived together. Until, one day, graduation came. The young woman, now 21 years old, wore the black gown and blue cap with trembling hands and teary eyes. The hall was full, decorated with balloons, flowers, and applause. Friends, colleagues, teachers, everyone celebrated the end of a journey. But for her, that moment wasn't just an end. It was the consecration of everything he had experienced, of every tear, every pain, every broken silence. The lady was there, sitting in the front row with a more fragile body, but with the same firm gaze. He wore a navy blue shawl, his hair tied up carefully, his smile restrained but present. His mou eyes were full. His hands rested on his lap, pressed against each other, as if trying to hold back all the emotion that day brought. When they called the young woman's name to receive the diploma, time seemed to slow down. She walked to the stage with firm steps, her heart racing, her eyes fixed on that woman who so many years before had offered her a loaf of bread. It was for her, it always has been, and now finally it was for her. In her graduation speech, she was the last to speak. He went on stage, took a deep breath, and for a moment hesitated. He looked at the audience and fixed his eyes on the lady. And then he spoke. His voice trembled at first but soon found its tone. He told his story, not in detail but enough for everyone there to understand that this victory was not only hers. He said clearly, with emotion, with truth, there was a reason behind everything. And that reason was there, sitting in the front row with teary eyes and a celebratory heart. When the applause ceased and the lights of the ceremony began to go out, there remained a feeling that words could not translate. It was as if time, with all its haste and distance, had bowed before that story, allowing, for a brief instant, the past and the present to intertwine in the same line. The young woman, with her diploma clutched in her arms, came down from the stage with firm steps. Her eyes were looking for only one destination, the embrace of the woman who had saved her with a simple gesture years ago. It was not an ordinary hug. It was a fusion of stories, a silent surrender of everything that had been lived, overcome, and transformed. The lady, with trembling hands, touched the young woman's face with the same lightness with which one day she handed over that first loaf of bread, and the young woman, now an adult with her gown still on her shoulders, smiled with the same tenderness with which years ago she accepted to enter the door of that house where she learned what home was. In the following days, still with her heart warmed by the tributes, the young woman did not say much, but there was an idea that didn't leave his head, an old desire, carefully guarded, which now pulsated with renewed force. It was as if, after all the achievements, something was still missing, not out of vanity or the need for recognition, but out of a deep sense of gratitude. She knew that as much as that diploma represented a new beginning, it was also the end of a cycle. And cycles sometimes ask for silence, other times they ask for a return. That morning, the sky was clear, with clouds scattered like cotton. The young woman asked the lady to accompany her to a place. He did not say which one. The woman, even with the fragility of age, put on her flat shoes, took the battered bag, and walked next to her without asking questions. It was not necessary. Among them, silence has always had value. And in that silence there was something ceremonial, as if they both knew they were about to relive a scene frozen in time, but now with new colors, new meanings, new strength. The path was known, but it seemed new. Every corner, every pole, every graffiti wall brought buried memories. The young woman, now with sure steps, walked with the same expression as when she went on stage at graduation, firm, grateful, and aware of where she came from. The lady next to her watched with a mixture of tenderness and amazement. It was like watching a movie that had started in black and white and now unfolded in vibrant color. As I turned the last street, the scene revealed itself. The old market was still there with its peeling walls, the simple facade, the sign worn by the sun. The entrance was the same, the glass doors still creaked when opened, the smell of warm bread still escaped from the shelves. But now everything seemed smaller, or maybe it was she who had grown up. The young woman held the lady's hand gently and entered. The fluorescent light, the sound of the cashier registering purchases, the announcements on the loudspeaker. Everything was the same, but the world inside had changed, not because of the place, but because she was no longer the girl who once cried of hunger next to the bread. She walked through the corridors as if scrolling through memories. He passed by the cookie shelf, the organized fruits, the cold cuts, and then it stopped. It was there, the same shelf as before, the same basket of French breads covered by a white cloth. His hands trembled, not out of fear but out of reverence. He touched the bread carefully as if rescuing a fragment of the girl who still lived in some corner of his soul. She took one of the loaves, took a few steps to the center of the corridor, knelt down, held it with both hands and, with teary eyes, held it out to the lady who was watching her without blinking. There were no words, but the scene spoke for itself. It was there that it had all begun, not with promises nor with speeches, but with that gesture, a loaf of bread spread, a choice made in silence, a destiny transformed. Around, customers stopped. Employees too. The hubbub of the market dissolved into a spontaneous, almost sacred stillness. And when the lady, now with her eyes full of water, took the bread from the young woman's hands and held it to her chest, the eyes met one last time in that space. It was at that moment that the applause came, soft, shy, but loaded with something that is rarely seen among the shelves of a market. Commotion. No one there knew that whole story, but everyone seemed to understand what it meant. Because certain gestures are universal. Certain pains are recognizable even by those who have never experienced them. And certain victories speak for themselves. The lady wiped her eyes with a folded handkerchief in the pocket of her blouse. Seu, young woman stood up, held her hand firmly, and together they walked out the same door where, years before, a dirty, hungry girl had been pushed out with contempt. Now, however, they left with their heads held high, like someone who closes a cycle, as someone who returns to the starting point not to relive the pain but to honor the journey. And as they crossed the sidewalk under the same sky that once covered them in silence, a serene feeling took over them both, that what was built between them would never fit in a single word. Because it was greater than gratitude, greater than affection. It was love that became home. It was pain that became a memory. It was a story that, even with all the marks, could only end like this, in peace. Sometimes all a life needs is a single gesture to change direction, a loaf of bread offered, an open door, a silence that welcomes more than 1,000 words. That girl who once cried forgotten among shelves today transforms other stories in the same way that one day they transformed hers. With time, with care, with presence. If you've come this far, it's because this story has touched some part of it. So write in the comments, "I believe in the power of a gesture," just so I know you walked with me to the end. If this story moved you, leave your like. This is how we understand that it is worth continuing to tell stories that warm the chest and remind us of what really matters. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is a good time. Here, each video is an encounter with humanity that we sometimes forget still exists. There's a video here on the side that tells a similar story, with tears, new beginnings, and that kind of ending that we don't forget. Click and stay with me there.